Look, I don't want to delay this bill any further, and I understand this bill does need to be passed, notwithstanding the debates we might have about it. Which is why a little bit odd that anybody would oppose it, because this is money that we have to have spent to keep the show on the road. We might want to spend it differently, or we might want to spend more, but we do need this money to cover the costs of the things that the public services and so on that carried us through this year. But I do just want to, and I understand the committees scrutinise stuff, but not everything is scrutinised as forensically as it should be. So it is, I think, appropriate to use this last opportunity to question certain things about whether we have done a proper cost-benefit analysis as to whether we're spending the money in the best way possible to deliver the outcomes that we want, whether the expenditure has actually achieved the objectives that we desire, or if there might be better ways of spending the same money and getting better results for things. And I would certainly hope that any government would be open to thinking about those things. So, first of all, on the sports thing, I just want to say briefly, 24 million, I didn't say it was lost. I think the deputy across there used the phrase, whatever it was, it's going back. I didn't use that phrase. Yeah, I didn't use that phrase. My point simply is that 24 million is a lot of money when I know that a lot of clubs are looking for stuff and in many cases didn't get it. And I think it's simply an opportunity to highlight the fact that I think it would be a good investment to have a more proactive approach when it comes to trying to support sports in the community. I've said this before, that there is often a bit of a computer says no approach when clubs go looking for money. That if you don't tick certain boxes, that they say no. Or reasons are found to say no. And I think reasons should be found to say yes when it comes to providing the money for community-based grassroots sports clubs that are looking for more facilities, because to me it is absolutely obvious, given the growth particularly of participation of girls and women in sport, which has grown exponentially and is a fantastic thing, that there's a big catch-up to be done in terms of the facilities necessary. A lot of the facilities, I mean, even before we had the high level of women's participation in sport, a lot of the sports facilities in this country were pretty awful. I changed playing soccer in GAA as I did in containers and the side of fields and all the rest of it. And there's still quite a lot of that going on. But when you have large numbers of women getting involved in sport, you have to have decent quality facilities. I mean, you should have them anyway, but it becomes even more important. So I think there needs to be a more proactive approach, is the point I'm making, to giving the funding necessary to provide the best quality facilities for grassroots sports, which are often severely lacking. And I'm just marking that as an important issue that should be prioritised. The other thing, I mean, I won't go on, as you say, we'll debate it over the next while. But you see, there hasn't really been a cost-benefit analysis of this. And while you responded, I don't necessarily agree with you to some of the points I'm making, I don't think you're really fully responding. You see, at every single level, when you look at the breakdown, and I think it was produced by the Department of Finance. Oh, no, it wasn't. It was the housing. So in fairness, it's not your department. That came out in September. But it makes interesting reading, Minister. And if you look at the breakdown of the cost of construction of a house, all the different things, almost every one of them are, if you like, people who are being brought into the process from the outside. Now, of course, there's going to be contractors and private businesses, and I'm not suggesting they aren't going to play a role always in construction in this country, in the construction of housing and many, many other things. Right? I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, when you need to build the amount of housing that we now have to build, and where we've the deficit that we have, we're going to have to be able to do this on scale. And even people who are very middle of the road and a very, very long way from me, ideologically and politically, are saying that our private construction industry at the moment doesn't have the capacity. They just don't have the capacity. So we're going to have to grasp that nettle. And we're going to have construction companies that have the scale to build the tens and tens of thousands of houses, and those houses have to be affordable. I mean, part of the reason for the last crash is, because even when we got up to 70 to 90,000 houses a year, they were delivering them at astronomical prices. Banks were lending money to people who couldn't really afford to buy at those prices, and eventually the whole pack of cards came crashing down. Right? We better not go down that road again. But we could go down that road, because when you look at the prices that I quoted and that are in that document, I don't believe they're sustainable. I really don't. I think to be talking about a house at 450,000 just to build it, 550 for an apartment, at 590 for an apartment in the city, to build them, that's not sustainable. We're going to have to find a way to drive down the price of constructing housing. And if you have a company of scale, you do get economies of scale. You know this, surely, as somebody who's the Minister for Finance. There is a thing, I did economics for the Leaving Cert, I know about economies of scale, right? You get economies of scale. That's why I think we need to seriously look and at least do a cost-benefit analysis and say, could we drive down the costs by not having, you know, when even you clearly have a labour shortage, as we have at the moment, the money expended on trying to recruit people, find people, train people, and all the rest of it, and then you look at models like DSB in its heyday of having large numbers of apprentices trained. It was an attractive job to go into, so you don't have, you know, we couldn't have our electricity infrastructure operating on a boom-slump basis, could we? We couldn't. But our construction sector operates on a boom-slump basis. So we had a lot of construction workers in 2008, and then the numbers slumped, and we're having a real battle getting people back into construction, partly because of the bitter memory of what happened the last time. So we have to make it attractive again. So there are a lot of reasons, in my opinion, to look very seriously. I would say it's an urgent necessity, but to not be sort of flippant about it, and look seriously at whether this, in fact, is an absolute necessity in order to deliver the housing at affordable levels and the infrastructure we need to address the major problems facing this country. Very last point, because it may be the last chance I'll get to say it before the Dáil, and this is in this, and again, it's like outturns, and I've raised it with you many times, Minister, but the problems in terms of the money, the public money, which I want spent in the area of arts and culture, and particularly in the area of the film industry, it's still not delivering on the industry development test. It's not delivering on it. It's not delivering the income and employment security that the crew deserve and need, and that the actors, writers and performers in film and our creative sector, if you like, deserve. I was looking actually interesting on the CEO average salaries for people in different areas of the economy. The second lowest is 16,000 a year for people working in the arts. Right? So most people working in the arts are on an average of 16,000. It's a miserable, it's poverty income. That's pretty terrible for a country that really, whose reputation to a very significant extent depends on our fantastic literary, cultural, artistic heritage. That most of the people who work in that area exist on very, very low incomes and have very precarious employment situation. And we could be doing better. And the Equity, the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild have been saying if the government is putting money into this area and want to develop the industry, and indeed the film money that we put into this industry is supposed to be conditional on industry development. You can't have industry development if the people who are the core of that industry have absolutely no security whatsoever. Many of them just leave, the creative people just leave and say, what's the point in being a writer or a performer or a director when it's such precarity that I have to put up with and incomes are so low? So they have asked that the public money that goes into areas like film should be much more strictly conditional on the producers meeting the industry development test. For them, that means guaranteeing that they are not given crappy contracts where they are forced to sign away their right to future residuals. As all of those people used to get in the old days, they used to get residuals, often for the rest of their life. They don't get them anymore, but they are critical when you're on that sort of low income and living that precarious existence. And similarly for the crew, again this week, there's more of those workers are in the Labour Court, and they go in, and the film producer company that you give money to, who set up the DAC for the films they worked on, multiple, marches in to the Labour Court and says, I'm not their employer. I set up the DAC, I did set up the DAC, I got money from the government to make this film on the basis I was going to create quality employment and training, but they're not my employees. Even though it's obvious that they are the employers, because there is nobody else. And they got the money from the state. Now, I just don't believe it's fair to do that. And many of those people, Minister, live in your constituency. A lot of them live in your constituency, and they have been blacklisted out of the industry because they asserted their right to the recognition of their service for many, many years. And I think the government should do something about that, and it wouldn't take much. They just tell the film producers, stop doing this. We're not giving you the money unless you recognise the service of the people who are in that industry and acknowledge that you are the employer and that you don't hide behind the DAC. And I think you should make that change, and I think it would be good for the development of the industry as well as for the people who work in it. So, yes, I'm all for the expenditure and indeed for more in that area, but I think you should make it conditional on giving decent employment conditions and rights to the people who work in the cultural, arts and film sectors.
Count Corla, and thanks to all the deputies for the different issues they've raised. So I'll just begin with Deputy O'Snuddig, who raised an issue that I'm very familiar with because he raised it with me on a number of occasions. I think it is just worth putting this issue in a bit of context here. Out of €104.3 billion that's included within this piece of legislation, we are referring to €2 million of that €104 billion. But what Deputy O'Snuddig is doing is, however, raising important issues of principle, because he is saying that this is money which, in his view, is not subject to the normal form of Oireachtas scrutiny, and he wants to know why, and he then wants to know, is any scrutiny applied to it? So firstly, it is the case that this particular estimate is presented to an Oireachtas committee. It's done by me. It's part of the public expenditure vote. So it's done by the Minister for Public Expenditure. However, it is also the case, as Deputy O'Snuddig has acknowledged, that when I'm asked what is this money used for, I'm not in a position to inform the Oireachtas in relation to it. And it is a long-standing precedent in relation to this particular fund that it is not subject to the normal kind of disclosure that every other euro that is spent of our country's money is. However, that is not the same as saying that it is not subject to any form of scrutiny, because it is. What happens, because of the unique nature of this particular fund, is the Minister for Justice, the Minister for Defence, provides a certificate to the Controller and the Auditor General indicating that the money is being used in the way in which it is intended to be used. The Controller and Auditor General considers that certificate and then decides whether to provide a degree of authorisation to it or not. And the Controller and Auditor General has published in their normal accounts a statement to that effect. So while I'm not able to go into the kind of detail that I do about this money and its use, it is still subject to oversight in a different way, and the outcome of that oversight is published, and there is a statement from the Controller and Auditor General in relation to it. In relation to the point that was made by Deputy Boyd Barrett, firstly in relation to the housing issues that he touched on, he talked about, there's no need to be flippant in relation to it. I was being anything but flippant. I was responding back to the arguments that he made, and I do stand by them. I was making the point that while he can advance the case for the state to be involved in directly building homes through a new organisation, that's an absolutely legitimate argument to make. I was simply making the point, though, that in making that case, you shouldn't suggest that the state is not involved in directly building homes, because it is. But it's just done through our local authorities. It's done through Dublin City Council, Dunleary County Council in his case. And it builds many thousands of homes every year. And the question that I would put to him, which I'm sure we're going to be able to debate at another point, is that if this organisation would be brand new, would it be taking the place of what our local authorities do? Would it be competing with the local authorities? Or would the local authority be subsumed into this new organisation? The contention I'd make here this evening is the best way of us directly building homes is indeed through our local authorities. And if he wants the state to play a role in the management of land, and I think he's right, that's why we have the Land Development Agency to perform that role. But I know that's also an organisation that Deputy Boyd Barrett doesn't support. In relation to Deputy McGrath, he was refuting arguments, or to use his word, rebutting arguments that I wasn't making. I never for a moment said that the state hasn't played, doesn't have questions to answer in relation to the use of the country's money. I said we do. I acknowledged that in my contribution back to him earlier on. I was simply making a point that I think Deputy O'Donoghue was acknowledging, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, you'll stand up and you'll correct me, about the fact that there is cost price inflation happening that is not caused by the state. Now, you'll make the point back to me in the concrete levy, and I'll come on and address that in a moment. But I think you would acknowledge, if you do intervene again, that there are things happening now in relation to prices within the economy that our government is not, this government, or indeed any government, is not in a position to be able to constrain. I can't determine, and the government can't determine, what is the price of concrete. We have added to a bit, but there are other forces going on that are very separate to Ireland at the moment, that in turn are having a really big impact on the issue that Deputy O'Donoghue raised, that I'll come on to in a moment. But that's the only point I was making back to Deputy McGrath earlier on. And I'll make the point again, because it has to be made, that a carryover is not the same thing as the money being lost. In fact, it's the opposite. If a department has a carryover, it ensures the money is there for them in the following year, but in the absence of a carryover, they wouldn't be able to spend the money next year. And the reason why it happens is that if you have a department that, for example, is involved in building a bridge or building a road, sometimes the costs fall in a different way during a year to how they would have been planned. And that is what is at the heart of this. Deputy McGrath, continues to suggest that if a project overruns in any way, that is due to incompetence or inefficiency At times there are issues there that, you know, I'm accountable to the House for, but the vast majority of the times, I'll still argue to the Oireachtas that our country's money is used in the way in which the Oireachtas does intend it to be used. And you can see that in the quality of new school buildings that are being delivered. You can see this in the quality of the public and social housing that our local authorities are building. You can see this in the impact now of the National Broadband Plan and the impact that is having on towns and villages. And then finally, Deputy O'Donoghue raised a really important issue that is actually a really big part in the housing difficulties that we face at the moment, which is, as you said, that over the space of a short number of years, the cost of building a house, the cost of building an apartment has gone up by so much. Now, you're a builder, you're actively involved in this in the way that I'm not, so I suspect I'm going to tell you a few things you already know and know well, but I do want to put them on the record of the House because you've raised important issues. Part of that is the issues I've already talked about, what is happening in raw materials. Part of it is that we do have certain standards that we want to be met that I think are worth meeting, for example, in relation to energy efficiency, but it then has an impact on the cost of the home. And to pretend otherwise would just be to deny that there are trade-offs. If we want homes to be built that have a higher energy rating, and I believe it's worth doing that, because over time it will be good for the cost of heating your home, it will go down. I believe it will be good for your health. I believe it will be good for our efforts to get climate emissions down, but there is still a cost for it. The state absorbs some of it, but the person who's buying the home also has to face some of that cost as well. But then what you went on to do then is to say, well, should the state play a role then in lending that home, that money to deal with the cost of the additional credit that is needed to deal with the cost of building the home having gone up. What I would say to you, Deputy O'Donoghue, is that is the reason why we have Help to Buy. And that's why we increased the value of Help to Buy, which we did early in the term of this government, recognising that Help to Buy gives back to a taxpayer some of the taxes they've already paid. We link it to only new homes, and we include within that self-builds, because of if your son or somebody else is building that home directly for themselves, it's still adding to housing supply, and it's a home they're going to live in. But the very reason we have Help to Buy and then increased the value of it is to respond back to the issue that you are raising. And we also have in the First Home scheme that was set up between the Department of Finance, the Department of Housing and our banks, a way in which for home purchasers of certain levels of income trying to buy certain homes, the state actually does play a role in trying to bridge the gap between what they can afford and the impact of the macroprudential rules. And that's a way of doing it. But as I said, Deputy, you have called out a big issue which is affecting the supply and the affordability of homes. But we do have schemes in place to try to respond back to it. And I'm sure you'll have views in relation to their adequacy. You may well argue they should be bigger in value or so on. But we are trying to deal with the issue in a way that I've just described. So, Cathaoirleach, there's been plenty of issues that have been raised here that are not about the spending of money, but are really important to the well-being of those that we are trying to serve. And I've done my best to respond back to all of them. The final point I just want to make is Deputy Boyd Barrett talks about the need, to support sporting and voluntary organisations. I mean, if the sports capital funding that we are making available at the moment, in very large amounts of money, is a huge effort to do that. And far from the computer saying no, I think in many cases the computer is saying yes, because of the quality of the applications that are coming in. really amazing applications been made by nearly entirely voluntary organisations all over the country. And then earlier on in the week, the government made available large-scale infrastructure funding, a lot of which will be going to organisations that are a lot more than voluntary, that are running really big sporting activity, which is either about sporting excellence or also trying to continue to support voluntary organisations. So a lot of issues raised, Count Corda, but this is an awful lot of money. Again, I want to thank the House for the cooperation in passing it. And to go back to a point I made earlier on, even though the amount of debate here today may be relatively small, these figures have been debated elsewhere in the Oireachtas at some length during the year. Thank you.